Good morning or good afternoon. It's good morning here, very early in the morning actually. One of my favourite topics this week, group behaviour, and it's an area that social psychology, which is my area of speciality, has had a field day in the past with some really fascinating and extraordinary experiments that could never be repeated again today. They took place in a day when ethics review panels were a lot more quiet on campus these days. If you try and do some of the things they did then, you get yourself into some serious hot water. Anyway, let's get into it. Just to add, though, that I'm really glad those experiments did take place because they say some very important things about human beings. We'll go through a number of different points, but I might as well, rather than talk about what I'm going to say, actually say it. So get into the issue. Now, the group effectively requires at least two individuals interacting and dependent on each other. That means who've come together for a particular objective. So work teams, for example, a classic group within an organisational perspective, a group tasked for a temporary job. For example, we've got this crisis on, deal with this crisis, or a group that's permanently in place, for example, the HR committee that sits there and handles with whatever HR problems come forth. They can be both formal groups, such as those committees that I just mentioned, or they can be informal groups that spontaneously evolve within an organisation. Like in my business, a whole group of the print guys and some of the others would get together regularly for drinks, and they formed an identifiable group, but it was not one that I had any control over forming. People are pulled into groups or attracted to groups by the status of the group. High status groups have more pulling power, more attraction. They are drawn into a group by the appeal of reducing their own uncertainty about who they are. This is often the case by things like when you go to school. For example, as a primary school kid, you feel isolated and alone, and you're unsure of what to do, how to dress, or whatever. And we'll give an example of that a little bit later. But by joining a group, you get information on behaviour from the group, rules and norms. We'll be talking about all these things shortly. The chance to distinguish yourself from other people is another appeal of the group. And also, one tends to be pulled into groups that are similar to yourself. So groups do tend to form of people with similar characteristics. And distinctiveness and uncertainty directions. So, just to go back, there's this 5-part model. Like a lot of stuff that you learn at uni, we love to form things into models. It's partly good because it helps you remember things for exams, but it's partly a way of conceptualizing or abbreviating this massive knowledge that you have. The 5-step model suggests that all groups go through these set of 5 stages, and like a lot of models, they've got, I think they were rather appealed by the sound of, it's not alliteration, assonance, dissonance, assonance, forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. They obviously ran out of ideas when it came to the closure of groups, so we'll quickly go through these stages. During the forming stage, there tends to be people are milling around and uncertain of what the group's purpose is, and the group norms, group direction, etc. And then you get this dissonant stage where there's a lot of conflict, where people start to speak up as to what they think the group should do, and there's a lack of clarity in this initial stage. And then the norms begin to crystallize, roles get clarified, and the consensus starts to emerge. And then the group gets on with the job with its norms and goals and focused it can start to actually do what the group is supposedly meant to do. And finally, if the group is a temporary one, there's this closing down stage with the potential for revisiting what the group was about and providing a sort of epitaph. We did well. Like all neat theories, it's not always like this. The process doesn't go linear through all those different stages. There can be overlapping or skipping of stages. And groups can go backwards. They can end in conflict, for example, whereas this suggests that conflict's at the beginning and peace and calm and harmony is at the end. And conflict, by the way, can be a good thing in helping develop aspects to the group. There's a whole literature emerging about the value of conflict within organisations, which, if you have a chance to read up on it, that's actually very enjoyable and somewhat counterintuitive. For example, a great example is anger. Sometimes, if you have passive, relatively silent members of teams or individuals within an organisation, you don't really know what they're thinking, and an unacceptable situation can just perpetuate itself. However, when that person is pushed too far and they get angry, they might suddenly explode, causing a difficult situation, but also as a result of that difficult situation, clarity comes to the organisation. That person finally has a voice, and sometimes good things can come out of that voice being finally expressed. There's a neat alternative model, and I actually do like this one. It's the punctured equilibrium model, and I'm not sure why I was trying to show off by using two punctuated exclamation marks, possibly as a way to help memorize the punctuated equilibrium model. This is a very nice model, and unlike the 5-stage model we talked about earlier, the forming to a journey model, it basically just looks at 3 key stages, from the beginning to the end, and it's ideal for doing temporary groups and temporary group work. And it looks at, it claims that during the initial stage, things are rather dull and nothing much is happening. This is the kind of forming stage. People are milling around, and time passes. And they reach a point where they begin to panic and realise we've achieved nothing, we've got goals to get to, and we're making very little progress, and you get into this angst stage, the storming stage, if you like, and then suddenly, at this heightened level of arousal and performance, they push through to completion stage. Now, one of the things that is remarkable is this midpoint burst of energy. And research does support this model quite a lot, and finds remarkably that this A plus B divided by 2 time is actually that quite accurate marker of when groups get energized and begin to get on with things. And I made the note there, it's just like a student. You have this sudden burst of energy at the beginning of the semester. You just sort of read textbooks and consider your future, and then halfway mark, as assignments start to come in, there's this burst of energy through to conclusion. But remember, a group is not one. And we're certainly hoping that you're doing all your work as an individual and not necessarily as a group. No. Getting someone to read your work or essays to make sure the spelling mistakes are gone and it reads okay, it makes sense, there's nothing wrong with that. So there's a bit of group work there. All right, it's remarkably functional for temporary groups. So there is quite a bit of research backing this. So we'll talk about 6 properties of groups: roles, norms, status, size, cohesiveness, and diversity. Now these effectively are what we would call variables. So, for example, a nice easy example is that groups can be big or small. Groups can have high or low status, etc., etc. But cohesiveness tends to be, to a large degree, a characteristic of groups. And we'll be talking about this repeatedly in this lecture. And I'll start off with one of the most remarkable experiments. I promised you some. And this is one of
In
the...
the early 1970s, an experiment on the psychology of imprisonment was carried out at Stanford University by psychologist Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues, who created their own jail in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The students who volunteered for the study were carefully tested. Each had to be psychologically and physically healthy to participate. Some students were then randomly selected to act as prisoners, while others became guards. The researchers surprised the prisoners by having them arrested at their homes and dormitories. The prisoners went a series of rituals to establish their new lowly status. They lived in tiny cells 24 hours a day, cut off from their usual surroundings.
I'll pause it there, and because the audio is a little fuzzy. So what we've got here is an experiment set up by one of the most famous, almost populist psychologists, Philip Zimbardo. He actually made a career out of this. He did a number of other remarkable experiments, but this was one of the really big ones of his career. Anyway, the experiment that he set up was in the basement of a Stanford University, which is a very famous, in a relatively wealthy part of the US, a wealthy part of the US. And students were randomly assigned, and the students agreed to participate, and then they were randomly assigned to either be a prison officer, in which case they had 8 hours work a day, like a proper job, or prisoners, in which case they actually stayed at Stanford in the cells for 24 hours a day. What's remarkable about this study is what happened. They were randomly assigned, so there was no personality differences between the prisoner and the prisoners, and in quote marks. They were randomly assigned to either condition. And certain behaviours started to evolve, such as what you see here, that the prisoners start to behave like prisoners, and the prison guards start to behave like prison guards, telling them to do push-ups and
The guards, however, only worked 8-hour shifts, and they returned to their...
people really got into their roles, and this is one of the key things, that the role itself dictated the behaviour. People used all the information that they knew about prisons and prison guards from watching movies, for example, and that fed into how they behaved on this occasion. And the experiment did not last very long. I can't remember, but it was in the days before things started to get really out of hand. The prisoners became very compliant, and some became seriously depressed and disturbed. The prison guards, even though this is all a joke, just an experiment, the prison guards started to take on the role to too great a degree. This isn't the experiment that I would pick as showing humans at their absolute worst, but it is one of a series of experiments that show that if you put people in a uniform and give them a role, they lose sense of self-identity and gain on the identity of the role to a degree that you would not think was possible, or to a degree that you would think, oh, I wouldn't do that if it was me. Um, so we're going to be talking about roles, and I made a small visual joke here. There are a number of aspects of role that the textbook identified, and just quickly, role expectations, like the prisoners expect to be treated badly, and the prison guards think that they've got control. Role, and this relates to perceptions of the role. Role conflict can occur when you have a number of different roles in life, and the classic one is being a mother as well as being a employee. And you can have as many as 5, 6, and even more roles. You can be a volunteer at a local charity, a sports person on the weekend. You can be a chair of a particular committee at work, as well as being a technician who does soldering of components on the shop floor. So you can have different roles at work, and there can be conflict. For example, if you're a union rep at work, between your role as a union rep and your role as an employee whose first duty is to do a good job for your boss. A union rep is your first duty is to do a good job for your colleagues and other fellow union members. Role ambiguity occurs where roles are not clearly defined. This often happens in small organisations more than large organisations, where people have so many different roles they're not quite sure what their role is. And role change For example, people can be elevated, promoted, and that can cause them to experience considerable sense of role change. And when you get promoted, you might feel, well, I need to have different friends, or I might need to wear different clothes now. I might need to stop drinking as much with my buddies because it's not a good look for someone who's senior executive or something like that. And these norms inform behaviour and expectations about roles. This first video is genuinely funny. Stick it is.
Yo, pedestrian.
I think we may have, I'm actually recording from home, we may have a bit of a connectivity problem today, so what happens...
Realistically, class back the way like penny wagon and free. Double O flow. Got what you need, live and breathe on good smoke. Who till who low, who shoot, who kill, who win. See all permits fall. Never on scale, encrypted. My part of it is scripted.
And they turn the classical music back on again. I also show a clip there from Mean Girls where the girl, Lindsay Lohan, I was told yesterday, gets instructions from the Mean Girls on the things that you can and can't do. You know, you can only wear your ponytail, you can only wear your hair in a ponytail once a week. That explicit. And effectively, groups establish, norms either explicitly or implicitly. So, for example, when I started working at CQU, this is a city campus that I work at. I wasn't told, a dress code, but I had certain expectations about that, and there were other people wearing certain clothes. And I didn't need direct feedback as to, no, you don't wear shorts to CQU Brisbane campus, but no one else was wearing them. So there was a degree of modelling. So you can pick up without that kind of really explicit, Olaf, you shouldn't do this, this and this, and we expect you to do this, this and this. I did receive some feedback, quite explicit, and some of it somewhat surprising. Olaf, you don't need to do this, and you do need to do that. And that was part of how my role was established here at CQU. But some of it is just implicit, fed by myth, fed by expectations, fed by what kind of model I have in my head of what the role of being a senior lecturer in X, Y, and Z is. Of course, groups can also establish not just neutral and positive behaviours, but also quite negative behaviours. And I was warned that when I turned the volume down the other day, I actually turned the volume down on my voice as well, so I'll be very careful not to do that. See if this works. Anyway. Yeah, I don't get full volume or no volume in the system. Mel Gibson, the lone wolf. So, the police officer's role is really very well defined. There's lots of rules, there's a very strict hierarchy, there's uniforms, and there's procedures and protocols. And Mel Gibson, of course, violates all of them from absolutely violating direct orders, etc., etc. Mel Gibson's got a bad rap for various good reasons, but I do love some of his characters because there's a bit of a rebel and a lone wolf in me. Anyway, group norms can also influence people in a deviant direction, and there is evidence that simply being in a group does increase the likelihood of this kind of negative behaviour occurring, because it's almost as if we drop to the lowest common denominator of a group. And there's certainly a degree to which we hide within a group. Now, I'll give you an example. It's not a perfect illustration, but an incredibly disturbing one, which I'd like you to think about and take home, actually. and that is the Kitty Genovese case in New York, I think in the late 50s, where a woman was attacked in a very built-up area of America, of New York actually, and I believe she was killed from memory, and lots and lots of people heard it, but everyone assumed that everyone else would do something about it. So in full public view, in full public hearing, a woman was killed, and there was a degree to which I'm sure that if there was just one person there or two, and they could all see each other, they would have realised, oh, we must do something, there's no one else here. But by simply having a group around, everyone sort of quietly shuffling away thinking, oh, well, look, it's been dealt with. If no one else is doing anything, you get informational feedback from the group's lack of behaviour, and that feeds your own lack of action. So, you know, beware the power of a group to facilitate bad behaviour on the part of yourself as well as others. The conformity experiments, I'm certainly hoping we can show you this one. It's only quite a brief video, but it is. It'll also take an opportunity. I think the textbook has a mention of Stanley Ash, that's A-S-C-H, talking about the different lines on a screen and the group, how it influences how people see or claim they see objective reality. So the group not only enforces norms about behaviour, but it does so in cases where it also enforces a level of obedience.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white...
This is a lift case, and by the way, the evidence certainly does show that this kind of conformity that this video shows, it's a little bit annoying, but as I say, my connection at home is relatively slow, so I can very much sympathise with those of you who do have
the lady with the trench coat,
not such great
and
reception.
subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear.
Reception of internet. Well, I'm using Wi-Fi. So 3 experimenters go into a lift,
And you'll see
and one
how
non-experimenter,
this man in
the balding guy at the back, he's quite uncomfortable. He's showing his discomfort by touching his face. He's uncomfortable because he's the only one facing the doors of the lift, the other 3 guys. So this happens to behaviour, but it happens to a remarkable amount of human activity is affected by this urge to conform to the group.
tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little,
He begins to turn. Yes, literally, people are for turning. The take-home point of this, again, is that conformity is a powerful group pressure. So, for example, you see it in music concerts, you see it at sports stadiums, but you also see it at work.
he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again.
Well, we won't because my signal is not good enough, but the effect has weakened. These, you know, you can hear from the accent in the black and white video there that this is a video that was taken some decades ago. The effect has weakened, but it still remains quite high. I did the picture here showing of clothing, and I think for men in particular, in city or other Western cultures, very powerful. We tend to think of ourselves as individuals, but it's incredibly consistent what people wear in certain kinds of jobs. When I visit Bangladesh, I wouldn't think, for example, of wearing a shorts or a t-shirt, having bare arms or bare legs, even though the temperature over there certainly begs me to take some clothing off. I will not do it. So it has an impact on all of us, but it is stronger in collectivist cultures, you know, such as Asian cultures, for example. The textbook refers to reference groups. These are groups who are important or salient to you. So I don't use the backpackers that I pass every day as my reference group on how to dress. I use the people within the building where I work as my reference group, and they're more likely to guide the norms of my behaviour at work, for example. Status. Status characteristics theory, as I've written there, suggests that status comes from the power over the group. So people who have got power over a group tend to have higher status. Ability to contribute to group goals. So, for example, this can emerge within a group. So, for example, if you demonstrate yourself to have a particular knack at fitting a piece of equipment together, then you'll gain status within this working group in the factory as a result of that particular knack that you have or a particular ability. And also personal characteristics. And high status people tend to be better looking, richer, taller, friendlier, and more assertive. You'll often notice when a group is forming, to go back to that model, that one person pipes up. And this, I've noticed in my experience, it can equally be a man or a woman, though. It shouldn't surprise me if it's more men, simply because of cultural norms, who speaks up. That person may not be smarter, but they simply have had the first word, and they tend to take on the role, take on a higher status role as the leader of the group. These higher status people are better able to resist group norms. They often are more experienced, particularly in blue-collar jobs, and they have bigger budgets or teams, larger teams in white-collar jobs, and they're allowed to deviate and get away with it from norms more successfully because they are higher status. I remember a professor at St Andrews, for example, deviated from the norm. He was very, very successful, and he deviated from the norm of how to dress as a professor at a very prestigious university by wearing ski clothing and at one stage dyeing his hair with a streak. And this was before it became popular and with a different age group than when it became popular. I believe it was purple, and it was pretty obvious who he was dating, because she had also dyed her hair purple, so she was conforming to that little group norm. Okay, group size. Small groups tend to be quicker at doing jobs. The members individually tend to perform better. They tend to be poor at problem solving because there's less diverse input of ideas, and generally, collectively, they have this issue of what's called social loafing. And there's a great example in the textbook, and there's a great example from South Park here, but which, knowing the experience, it's not worth watching the video, just to make this point, which is that as a group grows, individuals put generally less effort in. Groups are fantastic for creating some kind of group norms and group conformity and cohesiveness. If you handle it well as a leader of a group, you can create extraordinary things, and extraordinary bad things as well, we saw as in Hitler's Germany. There's this experiment from Germany, by the way, looking at tug-of-war teams. Now, you can imagine thinking, as a person who doesn't know about organisational behaviour, that the tug-of-war team, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So if you've got 4 guys in your team, and you just have one of them pulling against one of their guys, you think, okay, it comes down to individual strength. But when you add 4 guys together, first of all, you'd add all the strength of the 4 together, plus additionally, you would add the power of the team to urge each other on, to not want to let each other down. But this is in fact not the case. This guy found that the more people that you added to the tug-of-war team, the less each individual pulled. I think it went down from the 80s in terms of kilo, or 90s in terms of kilo, down to the 50s, individual pull on that rope. Apparently social loafing, the degree to which people drop in effort and think, oh, the group will handle it, or I can hide beneath the group, is not a phenomenon that's found in every nationality. For example, Israeli and Chinese don't tend to have that problem, because it is a problem actually. Now, group cohesiveness, the textbook talks about a number of different ways in which you can increase cohesiveness, and the ones I'll just quickly go through them. Smaller groups tend to be more cohesive, you can actually, as a leader, encourage identification with group goals. Set the goal up there and say, let's aim for it. If you spend more time together, if you increase the group status and increase hurdles to entry. So, for example, to become a nurse these days, you have to have a degree. In the old days, you just simply turned up and started an apprenticeship. Stimulate competition with other groups, don't take that too far, of course, and give group rather than individual rewards, as well as isolate the group. And in class yesterday, I gave a great example of how all this would work. The example I gave was to do with ISIS, but I'll give it a real-world example, because I said, look, one way to get rid of the problems in the world where, you know, Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus are all fighting each other, and various brands of Christian or various brands of Muslim are at each other's throats. I said, you know, the only way that I could solve this problem once and for all, or at least temporarily once and for all, was to be attacked by aliens. I mean, that's a little bit fanciful, but I can imagine that if Mars attacked and we were all looking up to the heavens with our guns, we wouldn't be bothered about fighting each other. We'd fight the common enemy. But a real-world example occurred of this in World War II, where you know, levels of depression, anxiety, and unrest in Britain dropped dramatically once war was declared. They had the common enemy. And it's, you know, Britain was rife with divisive problems, trade unions against employers in the pre-war period. Once the war started, Britain hung together beautifully, and it was one of the reasons that they won, was that they were an island, isolated, with a very clear sense of identity, and with a common enemy. Group diversity has its bad side. It increases conflict, lowers morale, increases staff turnover, but it is more creative because you have more different kinds of input, more open-minded. And remember, we've talked previously about surface level and deep level diversity. This is a nice series of studies looking at juries, which are kind of ideal little groups that you can study, and they form and unform on a regular basis in every court that has a jury system. Not all countries do have jury systems, but let's say in the States, you'll have juries that consist of, you know, all black, all white juries, mixed and diverse juries, and they find that the mixed juries of different races, and this is on a surface level, because they could all be conservatives, but different colours, but on the surface they look different. They make fewer factual errors when discussing evidence, and they spend more time deliberating. There's been other studies, for example, with MBA students, which spelling mistakes suggested that more diverse groups act as a cue to being more open and saying, well, we don't all assume we know what each other thinks. So that acts as a cue to open up and share your diversity, such as it is. So group decision-making tends to be slower, and as I've said, conformity is continually drawing you in to behave in a certain way. Individuals can dominate, and it leaves the question of this kind of social loafing of responsibility, or diminution of responsibility. Who's responsible for the group decision? However, group decision-making often is more thorough, and greater diversity of views and greater creativity is created. And this is a point that's worth emphasising, this greater acceptance of outcomes. Even if you're kind of compliant and you socially loaf in a group format, you're still left thinking, well, I should have spoken up. And now that the group's made a decision and I've said nothing, I can't very well go against it. So there is this increased, however reluctant, acceptance of outcomes formed by group decision-making. In-group bias is this tendency to favour groups, members of one's own group, regardless of whether they deserve it. And this can be got even by randomly assigning people to groups through labelling. There's this famous experiments in the States, again, in the wake of JFK's assassination in 1963? I think it was 63, wasn't it? Where this teacher in a ordinary all-white town created, she felt that she couldn't explain racism and comments, because it was a very tense time racially in the States. She couldn't explain it to this group of all white kids. So she simply divided her kids up into blue eyes and brown eyes and created real interesting group dynamics on this random labeling that hadn't existed before, and found that after a few days, or I think it was even within one class of blue eye, brown eye labeling, the blue eyes would start to cluster together and see each other as blue eyes, the brown eyes similarly, and there was all this kind of conflict going on between the two groups as a result of this random labeling. And people tended to see blue eyes as superior to brown eyes if they were a blue eye, etc., etc. Interestingly, as the textbook points out, that Asians suffer less from this in-group bias and have a more rounded view of how things are. So finally, we'll focus on two characteristics of group decision-making: groupthink and group shift, and you need to be able to distinguish between these two. Groupthink is the individual's ability to think clearly is reduced, as we said, even in moral, ethical domain, but it may be more a surface rather than deep level change. What happens is deep down people are on the surface people are conforming, even when it comes to decision making, even though they deep down may have disquiet about something, they do not express that disquiet. And members police these norms and pressure dissidents, and dissidents stay silent, even though they are feeling this level of dissonance about it. There's little experimental support for a link between the cohesiveness of a group and groupthink, but there is evidence that having a strong leader there who's biased into a particular direction can draw the group into a single way of thinking or decision making. And it's actually probably groupthink is group speak think rather than groupthink, because in fact, as we've just talked about, there is quite a bit of evidence that this is rather a surface level phenomenon and not a think phenomenon so much. As biased leadership does tend to cause this problem. When it comes to risky shift, so going back to group shift, it's a hardening of an existing position. And this seems a little bit odd, and it doesn't happen every time in a group. But it seems odd that a group with its social loafing elements, you'd expect a group to shift generally or every time into a kind of happy medium, sort of bland, banal decision making. But there can come occasions, like with the strong leader, or with a group of individuals who sit on the fringes of a group, to take control of the decision making process and simply by using the dynamics of a group can quickly, you'll see this in bad decisions at corporate level, for example. One or two people's pet project suddenly becomes the group decision. It gets all the group resources thrown at it, and a more risky outcome ensues. And perhaps, as I say here, this sense of comfort that comes from being in a group and this muted sense of individual decision making encourages greater risk-taking in decision-making. There's not a lot of testing that has been done of this. I'm surprised by, when I've looked into the literature, risky shift or groupthink, keep forgetting the name, group shift. You shouldn't forget the name, could be in the exam. But there's surprisingly little amount of evidence of it, but there is enough anecdotal evidence of it. It's clearly not something that happens a lot, but it's something to be wary of as a manager or a group member, that this kind of thing may happen. Anyway, that's it. I've gone a little bit over time today, but I'm starting to relax, and I still have to have breakfast. So all the best, and we'll see you next week.